You are listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Isaac Warren. I'm the Director of Digital Communications at the Illinois Association of School Boards. And with me today, I have Patrick Allen, who is a Director of Outreach and Training, and he's going to be talking with us about our foundational principles of effective governance, specifically the first one, which is the board clarifies the district purpose. We're going to talk about how and why the board should clarify the district purpose. So, Patrick, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Isaac. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we just dive on into the first question here? And so when we say that the school board clarifies this district purpose, what exactly does that mean in terms of practical terms for students, staff, and the community?
So what that means is the board is responsible for the mission, the vision, and the goals of the school district. So if we apply that to the staff and the students and the community, the staff and the students will know what the overall mission of the district is. They'll also know what the goals are because they're going to be involved in those goals in some fashion, right? The staff is going to be the group that is ultimately doing that work, doing the, whatever those goals are, the staff's going to be doing that. Students will be involved in that as well, because ultimately it's about the student outcomes that we're looking for. When you're talking about the community, it's important for the community to know what the mission of the school district is, right? Obviously, educating kids is going to be a big mission, but there's more to it than that. It's not all just about, straight education. There's a lot that goes into that. So the community needs to know what that mission is. They need to know what those goals are. And ultimately, they need to know how the district is progressing on those goals. It's their tax dollars that are funding a lot of this. So districts should be responsible to those communities and should be reporting out how they're spending their money.
Sure. And it's not just, I think it goes beyond professional courtesy of here's how we're doing and what we're doing. It's a form of accountability for the district to their community.
Yeah, absolutely it is. That's, we like to say that board members are held accountable every couple of years at the ballot box, but this is another way where they're showing faith in their community by being open and transparent about what it is that they're doing, how they're spending the money, what they're spending it on, how they're progressing on goals, those kind of things. So I do think it goes a long way in building that trust with the community.
Sure. Yeah. I couldn't agree more there. Moving on to the next question. So we at IASB emphasize that boards detect district ends rather than developing them. So what does that process look like? And how would a board distinguish between detecting and creating?
Yeah. So the board, ultimately, they are going to develop those ends, but they should be detecting those from their interactions with the community. The second foundational principle that you'll talk about is the board connecting with the community. And as a preview, what that means is ongoing two-way dialogue between the board and the community. So the board should be out talking with the community, getting a feel for where they're at, getting a feel for what they want to see in the district, changes that they might want to see. So the board is going to ultimately gather all of that information. And then at some point when they sit down to do their plan, right? If it's a strategic plan, however they, whatever you want to call it, everybody in that room, all the board members in that room have that insight from people within the community that they can then sit down and start to develop those ends based on everything that they've been told along the way.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the second foundational principle. We're not talking about it today, but I think the running thing when we go through all these points is going to be that they do kind of like mesh into one another, and they're really not very independent. They're all related in some way or another.
Absolutely.
That's a very good tie-in.
Yeah.
How should a board go about defining who gets what for how much, and why is this question central to effective ends development, kind of what we were talking about earlier?
So it is a central question, but I'll answer that by breaking it apart, right? So I think that, when you think of board work is really the what. You're looking at kind of the high level of what they're after. So when a board is developing goals, they're not getting real specific. They're not putting together SMART goals for how something is going to be done. They're doing the overarching goal of what they want to see. Could be something like we want to have a horizontal and vertical integrated curriculum, right? That's not very specific, right? There's a lot of things that are a lot of steps underneath that are going to accomplish that. So that would be like a board goal, right? Superintendent's going to take in, kind of fill in the gaps of how all that's going to actually happen. So the board's going to focus on the what. The board also primarily responsible for the budget. That's one of the main things that they do. So when you are looking at the what, you also want to make sure you look at the how much. Because if you say, we want a new math curriculum, if that's a what that the board is looking at, and the superintendent comes back and says, for some reason, all the math curriculum is costing $25 million right now, the board's probably going to say, that's not that important to us. We're going to take a step back. So that's where the board and superintendent and really the administrative team all work together on that, because the board's going to define what the what is. The superintendent's going to go put a little more detail on that and kind of do the research for how all that ties in together. And then you're going to come back and make sure that all of that looks like what you thought it would. And when you look at the who, right, obviously it's going to be students, but there's going to be different students that are involved, right? Are you looking, you could simply look at gifted students. Are you looking at your regular classes? Are you looking at special needs students, right? There's a number of different students that you're going to look at that really all come into play when you're looking at these. Because as a district, you want to make sure that you're helping everybody, not helping just a certain class of students.
And must address both student learning and organizational effectiveness. We've kind of touched on this already. So how do boards balance these two areas when they sometimes seem to compete for attention?
They absolutely do compete for attention. I think that this is one, if you kind of think of a pendulum, right, it's going to constantly be going back and forth. The ultimate goal is we want to get that pendulum to stop right in the middle, right? We don't want to go too much on the student learning side. We don't want to go too much on the organizational effectiveness. We want to find whatever that middle ground is and be able to stay there. But oftentimes what we see is, for example, when a school is, or when a district is hiring a new superintendent, they're going to have a focus of what they want that superintendent to really start on. It could be, we feel like we've got a bad culture in our district. We want you to spend some time to really, ramp up that culture, right? So that's going to lean over towards the organizational effectiveness more. Or our test scores are not good. We need to work on that, right? So that's going to focus more on the student learning. And then at some point, you're going to come back and hopefully say, hey, we got our test scores in a good spot now. Now we need to work on our culture, right? So it's that constant back and forth where you really hope that you can just find that middle ground and be able to really stay there while focusing on both. However, we know that's difficult, right? Even, if you look at it from a political standpoint, whether it's state or federal, right? They've always got that focus that they're on, right? And here's all the focus here. And then the next year they're like, oh, we need to back off and go back over here. So I think that's what districts run into as well, is trying to find where is that middle ground? How do we just focus on both things at once, making sure they get the attention that they need?
And I think it's hard enough to make that determination internally. I mean, you've got this other layer of the community has its own demands of where they think the effort and the focus should be on. That can kind of pull the board in different directions at times. So, I mean, and it sounds like the pendulum's being pulled in 3-4 different directions.
Yeah, and the thing that really gets to be a challenge is, I think we all know that things don't move quickly in education. And I don't say that as a bad thing. It's just, it takes a long time for changes to really get implemented. And I think that a lot of people, they want to see those results quickly. And that can be a challenge for a superintendent, administrative team, an entire district when you're not going to see the impact of those challenges right away. If you have someone that you tell them we're going to focus on student test scores, it might be a year until you get the next set of test scores. And just because you see these scores doesn't mean that they even spend a whole year doing the new things that you wanted them to do to improve those test scores. So is it 2 years down the road or 3 years down the road until you're really seeing the impact of those test scores? When people want to see those quickly, right? They want to see all that stuff change. So as board members, it's really important to realize that you really need to set those goals, say what it is that you're after, but then step back and let that happen. You're still going to be getting updates. You're still going to be getting, regular updates from the superintendent on how things are progressing. but you need to realize those results could be a little bit delayed, and you need to be patient to see those.
I wonder how much of that is also maybe board members or even members of the community. Like you're saying, they want to see these results like almost immediately. And so this isn't feasible. And I wonder how much of that is driven by they probably have a student in the school system right now, and they want their student to experience or be able to experience some of the positive outcomes of whatever change they're trying to drive there.
I do think that that's probably part of it, right? I know that if you're on the board and you're talking about eighth grade math scores and you've got an eighth grader, I want you to do all that stuff now so my kid can be more prepared for freshman year. So I do think that comes into play. But I think that the biggest thing around that is that most everywhere else, when we want to implement a new program, we are seeing results more quickly, right? When I've got a corrective measure that I use with my son, I'm seeing results more quickly. I'm not waiting 2 years to see the impact of that. So I think that that's where board members who don't have experience in education aren't ready for how long it can take for that stuff to really work its way through the system. So that's where you do have to have that patience. You need to work with the superintendent to understand. If you don't think it's going quickly enough, sit down to the superintendent and say, why is this taking so long? Can you walk me through it? I'm sure they'd be glad to let you know what is happening, the changes that are being made, and how the progress is going to look. But, I think that the more you talk about that ahead of time, the more you set those expectations up front of what it's going to look like, the easier it is to happen. Because board members are going to expect quick results, but if the superintendent says, hey, we're not going to see updated results for 2 years, if you're setting that expectation, at least you're clear up front. We know this is going to take 2 years.
What strategies or tools can school boards use to gain clarity from the community, like listening, observing, or engagement methods to detect district purpose?
There are a number of different things that boards can do. We don't have one magic thing that works for every board because it's going to be different for every district. You could do something like a town hall if you wanted to, right? You could invite the community to come in and you could have questions that you ask, and gather information that way. What we've noticed is that town halls typically aren't that effective because people don't come out unless it's an issue that's really important to them, right? Back in 2020, a lot of people showed up for meetings, right? They had issues that were important to them for that time. Other times people just don't show up. You could send surveys out to the community to make sure that they're getting their feedback in. The problem with surveys can be if you don't know the right way to write a survey question, right? You can really lead to answers that you weren't expecting or that you maybe don't want. The other thing is people don't answer surveys as well, right? The 5 essentials is something that every district pushes and pushes and pushes, and they still don't get the number of results that they really want to see from their community. You can have board members that just go out and talk with people in the community and kind of keep results, in their own head. I've worked with districts that have Saturday morning coffee with board members, right? So they say we're going to be at this coffee house. 2 board members are going to be here from 8 to 10, and you can just sit down and talk. So, I think there's any number of ways that boards can pull that information from their community. You're really just going to have to figure out what works for your community and be able to do it that way.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity for some really creative ideas because, again, if you're making this bespoke plan you want to make sure you're not sampling the vocal minority of people. You want to sample the actual community and what represents them. And I think if you understand your own community, you can kind of work to that angle and figure out I know my community tends to react to these things, or that they know they'll come out for these sort of topics. So you're almost like baiting them to come to these things in a way to like engage them, because otherwise they just won't show up.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that just because it worked last year doesn't mean it's going to work this year. Because just like every class of kids is different, right? You've got one class that's really, really smart and has, super high GPAs, and the next class maybe not so smart, but they're super athletic, right? Every class is different. Every set of parents is going to be different as well. So just because a town hall worked here doesn't mean it's going to work the next year. So districts need to make sure that they're not just getting into a comfort zone of what's always worked and really figuring out what's going to work now as opposed to what might have worked in the past.
Absolutely. I mean, thinking about how much changes socially, culturally, even in the span of an election cycle for school board members. I mean, every 2 years, that's doesn't seem like a lot, but a lot can change in 2 years. Yeah. Um, so once the ends are articulated through written board policy and mission, vision, values, and goals, how does a district then ensure that every part of the organization is aligned with those ends?
Once you have the mission, the vision, and the goals laid out, right, then the superintendent and the administrative team are gonna that's where they get real strategic, right? That's where it becomes part of like a strategic plan, right? So they're going to figure out how something's going to get done, when it's going to get done, where it's going to get done, who's going to do it, what resources are going to be necessary, all of that stuff, right? They're going to have all this written up on the wall, and they're going to figure out how all this pieces together so we can get all this done in 5 years. Then once they get that done, then you have to figure out, okay, so these are our goals for year one. How do we make this happen? What I think is the most effective way to do that is to make sure that everybody in the district is somehow tied into those goals. The superintendent's goals should be very close to what the strategic plan goals are, right? Those shouldn't vary too much. The board is saying, this is important to us. We want you to implement this. That should be pretty much what the superintendent does. The superintendent can then turn around to the principal or assistant superintendents or however your district is set up and say, these are my goals for next year. I want you to do these, and I want you to do these, and I want you to do these, right? And you're kind of giving them pieces of that to be able to accomplish. And then that next layer down is going to turn to their reports and say, this is what I want you to do, right? And you kind of keep going all the way through the district until everyone in the district is tied into those goals. And all of that, everything that you do is tying back to one of those original district goals. Once you have that all in place, then you know everybody's working in the same direction. When you don't have that in place, you could have someone over here who's working on Project Z that the board doesn't care about, right? So all of their time and effort that's being put into that is something that the board and ultimately the superintendent don't really worry themselves about. But when you lay it out so that everybody's goals are tied back to those district goals, right, then you've got complete alignment.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things where like, you can have the best plan written down on paper, and if you just don't have the follow through or the right execution, it's just going to fall apart, and they'll have to do it again in 10 years anyway.
Absolutely.
However many years before everyone realizes, hey, we never really implemented the goals we decided on.
Yeah. It's a strategic plan that sits in a folder that's on somebody's desk that never gets looked at.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of finishing off this episode, I think it'd be good to have like a real world example of this. So can you share an example of a district where the clarity of purpose transformed the decision making or outcomes, and maybe what made that clarity possible?
Sure. So one of the things that is probably the most difficult about putting together mission, vision, goals, or a strategic plan and getting that to actually happen within the district is the implementation of that. That's where a lot of times they fail, right? That's where it becomes the folder on the desk that's covered in dust that nobody ever looks at. I've worked with a number of districts that have done a good job. One really comes to mind. What they did is not only in the development of all of those things, where they had administrators, they had staff, they had community members. I think we had 60, 70 people in a room that were all helping us put together this plan. After the plan was done, they had a district leadership team that was put together, and they had building leadership teams at each of their buildings throughout the district. Now, to be on that, you actually had to fill out an application and sit down for an interview. They didn't want this to be where they went out and just said, hey, Isaac, you're going to be on this team. They wanted people who really wanted to be, part of that process. And then they use those teams to have discussions about how things are going, right? Do we need to shift direction a little bit? Or are things not working like we thought they would? But also use those teams to say, this building isn't adapting as quickly as they should. How can we fix that? So then those leaders in that building are really the ones that then turn around and go talk to those folks and say, what are your holdups? Why don't you want to do this? What's the struggle? And then you can have those conversations. A lot of times the staff looks and says, well, these are goals that the board put together. What does the board know about my job? Which is fair, right? That's probably a fair statement. those building leadership teams can look at those teachers and say, I was there when we put those together. Here's the discussion that we had around that. This is why we landed where we did, and this is what the impact is going to be. And then they're hearing that colleague to colleague, not board member to teacher, and it becomes a lot easier to go about implementing that. So that particular district had real good success getting everything implemented within the first year. They were on track with where they needed to be. So then the subsequent years went off without a hitch.
Yeah. And I think in that story that you had really two standout points I'd like to kind of briefly touch on. That was establishing people, bringing in people who had the buy-in, and then using the people with the buy-in as their, kind of your point people for accountability, or at least knowing where your accountability is supposed to be. Because you can, again, we can have this plan, but if no one knows who's in charge of what, or like who's kind of manning this part of the plan, I mean, it's just going to fall apart because everyone's kind of waiting for a nebulous person they're not even sure of.
And they did a really good job. They didn't just open it up to the community to say, hey, anyone can come be part of this. Because when it's that generic invitation, people are going to say, that's not really for me. They sent out personal invitations to people saying, we want you to be a part of this. So they went to community leaders, they went to the mayor, they went to city council members, they went to business owners within the community, people that had influence within the community to really be a part and be the leaders, be the vocal folks in the community talking about this once it actually got going.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much for coming in and talking about this first point of the foundational principles of effective governance. It's a great way to kick off this series, and I'm looking forward to going through some more with more members of your department. And I think this is going to be a great series for this summer. So again, thanks for coming on the podcast.
All right. Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your platform of choice. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to send us an email at communications@iasb.com. Thank you.